Be on guard for some wild news involving astronomy, astrology, and perhaps even UFOs. What we'll get is a glimpse into no less than the hidden architecture of time itself. In other words, expect redactions. This full moon is likely to mark an important moment of revelation or a turning point of some kind. Events at the full moon will give us clues as to what that February eclipse will bring for the US. Keep an eye out for revelations about the deeper purpose of his operation and why he was able to operate with impunity for so long. You really can't make it up. Hello friends, and welcome to this month's forecast episode. What happens this month will foreshadow what's coming in the spring of next year when things get really crazy. So it's going to be a crucial month to pay close attention to. I'm your host, Dan Waits. This is World Astrology Report, and welcome to another journey into the past to understand the present and the future. Before we get into the forecast, let's take a quick look at some of the developments of last month. The theme of last month's forecast episode was Deep Secrets Revealed. And the reason for that was that there were powerful configurations of planets in the water signs recently. We've had Jupiter in Cancer forming a trine with Saturn in Pisces, and planets that moved through the last degrees of Scorpio last month completed a grand trine with the slower planets. Scorpio is a sign of secrecy, power games, and skullduggery, and so I strongly suspected we'd see revelations about Jeffrey Epstein and his associates as these planets made their energies felt. Under immense pressure from his own MAGA movement, President Donald Trump signed into law the Epstein Files Transparency Act, which will mandate the release of all the Department of Justice's files on Epstein, including court transcripts. That act was signed into law on November the 19th, right as a remarkable new moon in Scorpio, conjunct the messenger Mercury and opposing revelatory Uranus was forming. You really can't make it up. Mercury is still retrograde right now, so we might not see news right away, but it stations direct on November the 29th. I think as the messenger planet gets moving and trines Jupiter and Saturn once again in early December, we may well see some very interesting information coming out about more powerful figures. But it's obvious that Epstein's operation wasn't about fun and games. It was clearly a blackmail operation that was probably linked to one or more intelligence agencies, as investigative journalist Whitney Webb's thorough research on this has shown. So keep an eye out for revelations about the deeper purpose of his operation and why he was able to operate with impunity for so long. It seems at least possible that this could be one of the consequences of the ongoing pressure on this issue. I also pointed out last month that I thought the full moon in Taurus on November the 5th would likely bring the death of a significant person, given that the sun and moon of the chart were conjunct Memoria and Libitina, respectively, two asteroids associated with famous deaths. And it did, although it wasn't quite the kind of figure I was expecting. On November the 4th, as this full moon was forming, came the death of Dick Cheney, architect of the War on Terror, who happened to have a stellium in Taurus. And one last thing. Last month, I said to watch Mexico and its relations with the US after Mars moved into Sagittarius on November the 4th. Since then, we've seen violent protests in Mexico City erupting against the government of Claudia Sheinbaum, and tension between the US and Mexico after President Trump proposed strikes against drug cartels on Mexican soil. According to the geodetic map, this is the region of the world associated with Sagittarius, which includes much of the US, Canada, and Mexico. Mars moving into Sagittarius has brought greater tension, aggression, and conflict to this part of the world. All right, well, that's it for this month's review. Let's get into our forecast for the month, which I think is going to be noticeably more intense in terms of world events than November. On December the 4th, we'll see this year's full moon in Gemini. This lunation will have more power and significance than your average full moon, because it's happening at the south bending. The bendings are the 2 points in the sky that are exactly square to the lunar nodes. Most of you know very well that the periods around eclipses tend to be the most unstable times of the year, when the pace of change noticeably accelerates. Lunations that take place at the north and south bendings carry some of that eclipse energy of accelerated change. For that reason, we already know that this full moon will pack more of a punch than average. This full moon spans the Sagittarius-Gemini axis, so at a mundane level, it will have to do with international trade, travel and foreign affairs, knowledge, truth, media and publishing, it will almost certainly bring big news. And I would say there's going to be a sense of frustration or friction mixed into this moment because there's a square between Mars and Saturn that's mixed into the energy of the moment. Mars is with the Sun in Sagittarius, while Saturn and Neptune are squaring both the Sun and Moon from Pisces. Even though Mars and Saturn are a few degrees away from exactly aspecting the full moon, they're configured by sign. Squares between Mars and Saturn signify times of frustration, suppressed desire, difficulty in making progress, and conflicting interests. They can bring anger, tension, and later on explosive moments when that tension is released. Among other places, I'm going to be looking for Germany to be in the global spotlight around this time for a couple of reasons. Firstly, through astro mapping, we can see that the full moon will be going exact right on the midheaven over Germany. What's more, I have 3 charts for Germany from 1871, 1949, and 1990, and all of them have significant placements in Gemini, and in particular, the second decan of that sign. Why would Germany have all these Gemini placements? Well, Germany was split into 2 during the Cold War, 2 twins, you could say. And historically, Germany was composed of many small states that were only unified in the late 19th century. Even to this day, Germany is a federal state. It's several relatively independent entities rolled into one, and that's Gemini, the sign that contains multitudes. So I think this full moon is likely to mark an important moment of revelation or a turning point of some kind for Germany, given it's going to be conjunct the Mars of the 1990 reunification chart. I'm thinking we may see news coming out that has to do with ongoing German remilitarization, Russia, and the Ukraine war. Now, something to know about full and new moons at the bendings is that they serve as way stations between eclipse seasons. Some events at these lunations recall the events of the previous eclipse season, about 3 months previously, while others foreshadow those of the one coming 3 months later. In the bonus section of this video, which I'm making available to everyone this month, I demonstrate how this really works with some mind-blowing new research. We'll look at the 2 eclipse seasons of this year and see how the full moon at the south bending on June the 11th both recapitulated events of March's eclipse season, including EU rearmament and the mind-blowing discoveries at the Khafre Pyramid, and eerily foreshadowed those to come in September, including the killing of Charlie Kirk. What we'll get is a glimpse into no less than the hidden architecture of time itself. Now, this Gemini full moon is going to bring events that recall the major eclipse events of September this year. And so I could see important new information coming out about Charlie Kirk's killing or events that could be seen as reactions to it. Another of the major developments at September's eclipse was the so-called Gen Z revolution in Nepal, which saw the ousting of the prime minister. I could see the coming full moon bringing more developments there or perhaps in other Gen Z revolution hotspots. And September also saw massive anti-immigration protests in the UK, organised by the anti-immigration activist Tommy Robinson. I could see events in early December that are somehow downstream of those, perhaps more protests or a significant announcement from Robinson, who, perhaps unsurprisingly, has a big Sagittarius stellium. Events around this full moon will also foreshadow the next eclipse season coming in early 2026, when we'll see a solar eclipse in Aquarius on February the 17th, and a lunar eclipse in Virgo on March the 3rd. Now, the Aquarius solar eclipse will come at 28 degrees of Aquarius, which is just a degree from the moon in the US Sibley chart. The moon in a mundane chart represents the people, so it's likely to have important implications for the United States. But a lot of movers and shakers in US politics have placements around or opposing this degree, including Donald Trump, J.D. Vance, and Barack Obama. Events at the full moon will give us clues as to what that February eclipse will bring for the US, so watch closely in early December. That same Aquarius eclipse next year is also hitting a number of charts related to the Arab world, including those of the UAE and Qatar, and it's opposing Mars in the Israel chart, so it could well bring more violence to that troubled region, and we may see suggestions of what that will look like in early December. Moving on, keep the dates of December the 6th and 7th in mind, because at that time, Mercury forms another one of these incredible grand water trines with Jupiter and Saturn. This is one of the most positive configurations of the month. It looks like a time for deeply insightful and compassionate speech that generally speaks to the soul. There could be mental breakthroughs in our understanding of what drives and inspires others and our history with other people. That said, this understanding could be driven by a sense of frustration or conflict because Saturn will be squaring Mars, ruler of Scorpio. As I said earlier, look out for revelations coming from the Epstein case at this time, but bear in mind there will probably also be some frustration in the air. In other words, expect redactions. And this Mars-Saturn square is also really interesting because it too foreshadows events in 2026. If you're enjoying this video so far, please do click the like button down there and make sure the algorithm knows you like this sort of thing. And please do consider subscribing and enabling notifications to make sure you catch new content and give the channel a boost. Oh, and I have some good news this month. I've decided to make the full extended World Astrology Report members version of the video available to all for free on YouTube. Firstly, because I'm excited about the research it contains, I want to get it out there. And secondly, because I wanted to show you the kind of material that members of World Astrology Report get to enjoy with almost every episode I put out. Signing up as a member on the website is my best value offer because it also gives you access to my monthly long-form live streams where I do some of my best work. The next one will be my 2026 forecast. It's happening on Friday, November the 28th at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. And you can find more details on the live streams page of worldastrologyreport.com. Entry is free for website members, or you can purchase entry just for this stream via that page. All right, let's keep going. On December the 9th, Mars and Saturn will form an exact square, although the aspect will be in play through the first half of the month. This is the last hard aspect of the synodic cycle of Mars and Saturn that began with their last conjunction in Pisces in April of 2024. Mars will be in Sagittarius, the sign of the archer, while Saturn will be in Pisces, the fishers. These are both Jupiter-ruled mutable signs that have to do with gnosis, the experience of truth. In an archetypal sense, I think there's a theme of resistance to change or difficulty in making changes coming up here. The mutable signs in general are about transitioning from one thing to another, and the state of duality that exists when that happens. But with the two malefic planets in these signs, there's a conflict because Saturn is blocking the action that Mars wants to take, or at the very least, there's a difference in opinion on how fast things should move. Mars wants to move quickly, while Saturn wants to take things at a slow pace. And when these two planets form a square, there's tension or friction or frustration in the air. Now, in terms of world astrology, the 2-year Mars-Saturn cycle governs situations of sustained challenge. It's like a metronome timing the rhythms of difficult storylines of war and pestilence and contention that unfold in the mundane realm. In recent years, we've seen major developments during the COVID-19 pandemic, the Ukraine-Russia war, and during the current cycle, the Iran-Israel war, resonating to the rhythms of this cycle. The current 2-year cycle has brought conflict between Iran and Israel, repeated accidents at the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, and freak weather events, among other things. We could see any and all of those themes coming up again at the closing square. What's also important to consider is that Saturn is conjunct Neptune, which is adding a sense of unreality, confusion, and distortion to certain aspects of life right now. At the square, there could be a deceptive or illusory aspect to what happens, making the true story hard to establish. Events that have to do with the ocean, faith, liquidity, and global trade might arise. In last month's forecast, I talked about Mars's move into Sagittarius and how I thought it could see the US taking aggressive action against Venezuela. We've certainly been seeing developments in that direction, with Trump having sent an aircraft carrier to the Caribbean and, according to the New York Times on November the 18th, approving CIA operations in that country that may be intended to prepare the ground for military action. Watch Venezuela at this point in December. In Venezuela's 1830 chart, Mars is at 25 Pisces, so Saturn will be conjoining it, while Mars will be squaring it. That looks to be signaling that country being put under a lot of pressure at that time. What's more, the US 1776 Sibley chart has Mars at 21 Gemini, so early December we'll see the US's Mars opposition. This is a key moment in its very own cycle of assertion and contention. If we look back to what happened at the Mars return in August of 2024, we saw a turning point in US-Venezuela relations. Nicolas Maduro won a presidential election in Venezuela in late July, something the US did not approve of. And on August the 21st, the very day of the Mars return of the US, it was reported that the US was now considering sanctions against certain influential Venezuelan figures. So I think conflict between the US and Venezuela is baked into this 2-year Mars cycle, and I suspect things will heat up in early December. Just as the square is forming, Mercury will be opposing Uranus, so we can also expect shock news and announcements at this time. That Mercury-Uranus opposition perfects on December the 11th, just after the Mars-Saturn square. What's also worth bearing in mind is that Mars and Saturn will be in the two signs ruled by Jupiter at this time. So whatever happens serves the agenda of Jupiter in Cancer. I'm thinking we could see rhetoric at this time that has to do with protecting the homeland, you're with us or against us, daddy knows best kind of stuff. Similarly to the Gemini full moon, this square aspect will be worth paying close attention to because it's giving us a preview of what's coming in 2026. The events at this waning square will foreshadow events coming when Mars and Saturn form the next conjunction at 7 degrees of Aries on April of 2026. As an example of this phenomenon, consider that Mars and Saturn last formed a conjunction in mid-April of 2024 at 14 degrees of Pisces. Around this time, we saw an attack on Zaporizhia nuclear power station in Ukraine that led to warnings from the International Atomic Energy Agency. On December the 1st of 2023, with Mars and Saturn about 4 degrees from an exact waning square, the International Atomic Energy Agency reported that power lines at that plant had been cut, and it issued a warning about safety at the plant. So this incident foreshadowed the more serious development, the attack on the plant at the conjunction in April 2024. So I think you can see how this foreshadowing effect works. So again, pay close attention to what happens in early December when Mars and Saturn start to get close to their exact square, because those events are going to clue us into what we'll see at their conjunction in April 2026, as well as the themes that will subsequently unfold during the 2-year cycle that begins at that time. That April conjunction is coming in the fiery Mars-ruled sign of Aries, so we have to be ready for it to signify bold action, violence, and war themes. It's hitting the chart of NATO hard, as well as those of the UK, France, and Germany. So if I had to guess, I'd say that April is going to see some kind of escalation in the Ukraine conflict from NATO, probably framed as a response to something Russia has done, and we'll get a foreshadowing of this event in early December. Looking at the chart of Russian President Vladimir Putin seems to confirm this. There are some question marks over his true birth date and time, but according to the official story, Putin was born on October the 7th of 1952, with Saturn and Neptune in conjunction, as they are now. If correct, his chart has Mars at 26 Sagittarius. So this Mars-Saturn square is coming almost exactly at his Mars return, which means it's a significant moment for martial themes for Putin and by extension for Russia itself. The same logic also applies to China, whose 1912 and 1949 charts are being triggered by the Mars-Saturn conjunction in April. Taiwan's 1912 chart has a descendant at 7 degrees of Aries, where the Mars-Saturn conjunction is happening. That all seems to spell trouble for Taiwan, presumably coming from China. I wouldn't expect an all-out war at this point because honestly, I don't think China needs to do that. So why would it? But it may put more pressure on Taiwan, whether through military threats or action against its ability to trade. Again, watch China and Taiwan in early December for hints of the trouble to come. Okay, that's it for now on Mars and Saturn. Let's move on to the second lunation of the month, a new moon in Sagittarius. We have been seeing some really interesting lunations here in late 2025, and this doesn't let up because there's a second one in December. On December the 20th of 2025, just before the winter solstice, we'll see a new moon at 28 degrees of Sagittarius. Now, first things first, a new moon in Sagittarius signifies new beginnings in the domain of that sign, which has to do with the quest for truth, with the ability to sustain optimism regardless of what life throws at you. Sagittarius represents a different part of life for each of us, depending on how our charts are configured. But using whole signs, the house that Sagittarius takes responsibility for will represent a part of life where you apply that optimistic, adventurous, high conviction Sagittarian attitude, or where you're likely to encounter people and situations that reflect it. Expect a new beginning in that part of life. But it's not quite as simple as that. This is a complex new moon that's not so easy to interpret. It's quite closely conjunct Venus, planet of pleasure, beauty, and unity, which is something we usually like to see. But the Sagittarius planets, including Venus most of all, are square to Saturn and Neptune in late Pisces. A new moon square to Saturn suggests that our new beginning is born of limitation or denial or doing more with less in some way. But we also have a square to Neptune. This may bring the sense that we're not seeing things clearly. We might be under illusions or comparing reality to the ideal and finding it wanting. The Venus-Saturn square here is the tightest aspect of all. Venus in hard aspect to Saturn brings a sense of distance or denial or disconnect in love matters. It's the forever alone transit, and it's not great for money matters either. Given that all these Sagittarius and Pisces planets are ruled by retrograde Jupiter in Cancer, I would wonder about the potential for bad news about the housing market at this time. It may also bring bad news for the AI industry, as it's square to the Saturn-Neptune conjunction that I think is related to AI and its weirdly illusory and deceptive nature. Oh, and this new moon is also in a tight 150-degree quincunx aspect to Uranus, so there's probably some sense of irritation or frustration here, and a sense of instability and sudden or unexpected changes to the course of events. And in general, I think we could see some weird news at this time, where we're not sure whether to believe it or not. Be on guard for some wild news involving astronomy, astrology, and perhaps even UFOs. This new moon is conjunct the asteroid Asteria, named for the Greek goddess of the stars, and it's also conjunct the galactic center. It's a new moon that will likely bring powerful omens and intuitions for those open to them. All right, we're almost through the month, but we have one last stop, Capricorn season. On December the 21st, we reached the winter solstice, also known as the beginning of Capricorn season. At this point in the year, the nights have reached their greatest length. And so here comes the triumph of darkness over light, the deepest descent into materiality. So it's natural that Capricorn should be ruled by Saturn, the traditional guardian at the threshold of space-time, and traditionally the ruler of the earth and the land and people who worked on it. When the sun enters Capricorn, the previous year is just behind us and continues to weigh heavy. New year comes with the sun in this sign, and so Capricorn is a sign that's very conscious of the past, of tradition. It's a sign of the establishment and of institutions that have stood the test of time. Capricorns then are builders and climbers, people with an instinctive sense for how dedicated work eventually brings opportunity. But despite their serious reputation, they often have a naughty or sensual side and a deep love for the natural world and the earth itself. The two primary triplicity rulers of Capricorn and the other earth signs are Venus and the moon, after all. Pluto showed us the extreme expression of this side to the sign during its transit through Capricorn from 2008 to 2024, when we saw revelations of the dark and debauched side of those at the pinnacle of power governing institutions through the Jeffrey Epstein saga and Harvey Weinstein and all the rest. The filmmaker David Lynch, who died this year, had his sun, Mercury and Venus in Capricorn. He described his life's work like this: as a kid, I was always building things. My father had a shop in the house and we built things. We were kind of a project family. I started out as a painter, and then painting led to cinema. And in cinema, you get to build so many things or help build them. All right, that's just about it for this month's forecast. Next up, I'm going to present some new research on how full moons at the bendings tie eclipse seasons together. Trust me, this is actually quite mind-blowing. These bonus sections are normally exclusive for members of World Astrology Report, but as a special one-off, I'm making it available to all this time. Oh, and just a quick note that this month's members live stream will be my 2026 forecast. It takes place on November the 28th at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. You can purchase entry just to the stream on the live streams page of my website, or you can sign up as a member on the site, because entry to all my streams is free for website members. All right, that's enough of that. Let's head into our bonus section. Hello, friends. In this bonus section, what I want to show you is how lunations at the bendings serve as way stations between eclipse seasons. Eclipse seasons come roughly every 6 months, so a full or new moon at the bendings will come roughly 3 months after one set of eclipses and 3 months before the next. Now, to understand how this works, we're going to look at the 2 eclipse seasons that we saw in 2025 in March and September, and see how a full moon at the south bending in June signified events related to the themes that emerged at the 2 eclipse seasons. On June the 11th of 2025, we saw a full moon at the south bending at 20 degrees of Sagittarius. We know it's the south bending because it came after the moon had passed the south node, which signifies the point where the moon's orbit meets the ecliptic plane and it passes south of it. You can see here that the lunar nodes were at 23 degrees of Virgo and Pisces, so this full moon was about 3 degrees from an exact square to the nodes, so it certainly qualifies as a south-bending lunation. Now, this full moon would have signified culminations and revelations and turning points related to Sagittarian matters, which include education, religion, international affairs, global trade and travel, publishing and law. Now, there are many ways of determining what a full moon will bring and which people and entities it will be significant for. But among them are the idea that a lunation at the bendings ties together two eclipse seasons. What I mean by that is that some of the events that it brings are going to be related in theme to those of the previous eclipse season, about 3 months beforehand. And some of them will be connected to the eclipses coming at the next eclipse season 3 months in the future. So let's start by looking at the major events that were associated with the March 2025 eclipse season, when we saw a lunar eclipse at 23 Virgo on March the 14th. And then came a solar eclipse at 9 Aries on March the 29th. What events can we link with that eclipse season? Well, this was a really intense month. We won't do an exhaustive review, but I want to pick out 3 big developments that I think were particularly notable. This month was when many of the so-called Trump tariffs came into effect, prompting all sorts of strong reactions from countries affected and in the media. The tariffs had actually been introduced in early February, but remember, the effects of eclipses can be felt weeks in advance. You might be thinking that will cover a lot of news developments if you have such a wide time window. So how do you know which events the eclipse is bringing versus other astrological factors? I'd say 2 things really. Think big. Eclipses bring the really significant changes, and the tariffs were certainly that. Secondly, you can also think of the sign of the eclipse and the eclipse chart itself and which other charts it's hitting. We saw an Aries eclipse, and Aries brings the new, and it's also an aggressive martial sign. And this was really the instigation of a new phase of the US-China trade war. Now, speaking of war, early March was also when Ursula von der Leyen announced the Rearm Europe initiative. In essence, this was a pledge to mobilize 800 billion euros to enhance the EU's defense capabilities, because essentially in this deglobalizing world, Trump's US wants the EU to be able to defend itself or fight Russia, depending on how cynical you are. But this was also significant because implied by EU rearmament was German rearmament. At the same time, Germany announced it would be investing hundreds of billions of euros into European security. And on March the 18th, Germany's parliament voted to remove long-standing limits on defense spending. In other words, the era of post-World War II German pacifism had come to an end. This was massive. And the third and final development I want to highlight came just before the spring equinox, when a team of academics announced that they'd used satellite-based radar techniques to identify massive structures hidden beneath the Khafre pyramid on the Giza Plateau. If their discovery turns out to have been valid, it implies a complete rewriting of human history. So we have 3 big stories there. So what happened at the full moon on June the 11th at the South Bending? Well, my claim is that very close to that moon, we should have seen fresh developments that followed on from those 3 big stories. And we did. First of all, the Trump tariffs. On June the 11th, the very day of that full moon, the US and China agreed on a kind of truce over the tariffs, whereby China would remove bans on exports of rare earth minerals and magnets needed by the US car industry. Now, on the question of European rearmament, on June the 11th, the very day of this full moon at the South Bending, the European Investment Bank tripled the amount of money it was making available for loans to businesses in the defense industry. That might sound like a dry piece of financial news, but following the money shows you where things are really headed. It was a revealing moment that showed that the Europeans really were, at least to some extent, following through on these rearmament plans. And in our third story, the Khafre project's incredible discoveries at Giza. Once again, we see exactly the same pattern, because right at the time of this full moon, the same team made a fresh announcement claiming that the Menkaure pyramid also had similar structures beneath it, and that all these structures were interconnected, forming a massive underground city at Giza. Jay Anderson of the Project Unity YouTube channel was an early breaker of this story, with this video released on June 11th. Yes, that's the day of that full moon again. So you can start to see this is quite a powerful predictive technique. But I think these lunations at the bendings also point forward in time to the next set of eclipses coming 3 months later. In September 2025, we saw a lunar eclipse at 15 Pisces on September the 7th. And a solar eclipse at 29 Virgo on September the 21st. Now, I want to highlight 3 major events that those eclipses of September brought. The first was the assassination of Charlie Kirk on September the 10th. I don't think I need to say any more about that one. I think we're all quite familiar. The second was massive anti-immigration protests in the UK. On September the 13th, there was a big rally in London organised by the activist Tommy Robinson to protest against immigration and asylum policy and so on. And the third was the so-called Gen Z protests in Nepal from September the 8th to the 13th, which ended up forcing out the prime minister of that country. Now, there were also events 3 months earlier in June around that same full moon that foreshadowed these eclipse events. Firstly, Charlie Kirk. I think it's fair to describe his killing as a political assassination. And on June the 14th, just after that full moon, there was a high-profile political assassination in the US when Minnesota State Representative Melissa Hortman and her husband were killed in their home. The state's senator, John Hoffman, and his wife were also shot but survived. Now, these were very different figures politically to Kirk, but the theme of political assassination and a violent ratcheting up of the stakes in America's political landscape is the same. We could have seen this as an omen of what would be coming 3 months later at the eclipse season. What's more, Kirk's own profile was extremely high and rising rapidly at that time. Around the time of the full moon, it was being reported in major news outlets that Kirk opposed the US getting involved in any Israeli war with Iran. Make of that what you will. Oh, and one last thing. This is really crazy, honestly. You think I'm reaching with all this stuff? Well, how about this one? In June, Charlie Kirk started talking publicly about how his work wasn't safe. Check out this story headlined, "Charlie Kirk told Kentucky crowd his work wasn't always safe 3 months before his death." There's our 3-month foreshadowing period. What more can you say? All right, our second story from the September eclipse season is the anti-immigration rally in the UK, led by Tommy Robinson. This too was foreshadowed at the full moon in June, because as that full moon was shining in the sky, there were big anti-immigration protests in the UK, this time in Ballymena in Northern Ireland. Again, this was a foreshadowing of what was to come, or an omen, if you like. And our third and final eclipse story is the Gen Z protests in Nepal that ended in ousting the prime minister there. These protests were organized online by young people fed up with corruption and nepotism, and it was sparked by a government ban on social media. Now, this is another one you can't make up. I've taken this from an article in eastasiaforum.org called "Nepal's Gen Z Protests Are a Call for Democratic Renewal," which explains how they came about. And you can read the story and see that I'm not cherry picking this. It specifically cites an incident on, you guessed it, June the 11th, the day of our full moon, as an inciting incident that led to the protests. I'm going to quote here. On 11 June 2025, the Kathmandu District Court issued an arrest warrant for journalist Dil Bhusan Pathak after he claimed that Jaivir Singh Dubba, the son of Nepal's then Foreign Minister Arzu Dubba and former Prime Minister Sher Bahadur Dubba, had purchased Kathmandu's Hilton Hotel by leveraging his parents' political influence. While the allegations are contested, the public, battered by an ever-widening wealth gap, was enraged by what appeared to be another case of elites using public power for private gain. In the following months, videos tagged #NepoKids exposed the lavish lifestyles of political families, fueling generational anger over privilege built on corruption. This criticism led the government to ban Facebook and other social media platforms, which then led to massive protests, which erupted on September the 8th, the day after that lunar eclipse. Again, you really can't make it up. And I think what we're seeing here is another glimpse into the real architecture of time and how one moment flows into the next. The events of one day follow on from those of the previous day, but there are other less obvious connections that link meaningful events across time. There are many such hidden structures, but this pattern involving lunations at the bendings is one of them. And so now you know why I'm saying some of the things I've said in this episode about this month's Gemini full moon. Remember, signing up as a member of World Astrology Report means you get one of these bonus sections with every episode. Just saying. Thanks for watching, friends. Let me know what you think in the forum or the comments, and I will see you again on the channel very soon.